Chocolate! Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hey guys, before we get into this list, I have a quick update. I was supposed to release the start of a new series, which I will reveal now was supposed to be a list talking about the best Nicktoons episodes that aired in 1991, and was gonna talk about the worst and best episodes that released every year in future videos throughout Nickelodeon history. Well, I've been very excited about that idea and have been hyping it up in the last video and have the script completed. I've been struggling to make the video due to having a hard time being happy with my script and constantly changing things. Simply put, it's been a real struggle to figure out how I want to talk about certain things in that list, especially because of drama around Nickelodeon for many different things. So while that video will come out eventually when I perfect that script, for now I'm putting it on hiatus and it'll come out when it comes out. Whether that's in the next 5 videos from now, or it's right after this one. So for now, I'm going to continue with my original video schedule, and in the next video, as of now, unless I decide otherwise, will be the top 5 best Simpsons Season 6 episodes. So I hope you're looking forward to everything coming up, and with all that said, let's get into talking about my favorite show. Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. Oh boy, have I been waiting to talk about this one for a while. It's always been one of the main ones I wanted to talk about on this channel. If shows like SpongeBob and TMNT 2012 were the shows that inspired my love for TV, and shows like Hey Arnold and Steven Universe were what made me want to talk about TV shows in a review-like format for others to see, then Avatar was what got me interested in film criticism in general and wanting to dive deeper and think more about what I'm watching and how much I truly am or are not enjoying whatever I'm watching, and why. Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of the best shows ever made, and it currently stands as my favorite show. Its characters are great, its world is big and interesting, the action is kick-ass, the animation, tone, atmosphere, and art direction are all top-notch. On top of that, with a great overarching story that each season follows. So, nearly every episode plays into it in a great way, with interesting plots and topics the show handles involving develop its characters, moving the plot forward in an interesting way, developing the lore, or exploring a new and exciting area for multiple reasons. Going through life-changing experiences that change the way you view a character or an entire nation. Okay, I should backtrack here, because we're not quite there yet. But this entire show has so many fantastic episodes for all these reasons, and Season 1 is no exception. This show just has some of the best episodes of television, period, that tackles such interesting stuff around its concept, and plots that develop its characters in an interesting way to make them as fleshed out as they possibly can, to a point where they feel like real people, which makes every episode, whether it be a goofy adventure or a very serious character-driven story, it makes it so much more engaging to watch, and makes the show more dynamic. Season 1, just like the other seasons, has great episodes, and all the things I mentioned can be applied to Season 1, so there are many great examples of what I'm talking about, and I'll get to elaborate on why all of that makes the show so great when I get into individual episodes, because there's a lot of great individual examples of why the show works so well with each of the episodes I picked, because it just kind of happened to line up that way, and I'll get to talk about some great honorable mentions as well. Well, Season 1 does have the task of setting up this world, its characters, and story. It does all these things beautifully. Sure, it stumbles a little bit here and there, and even though there is an overall story, it's a little bit less focused than it is in the next 2 seasons, along with handling a bit less overall, but that's fine, because that's why those other seasons exist, and they use its more lax structure in this season just to tell whatever episode they want and explore these characters in interesting ways. Sure, once again, it doesn't always work, but I'll cut to the chase and say there are no bad episodes of Avatar Season 1, much less Avatar on whole. The worst episode of the show is okay, with a few other episodes here and there just being good, but not great, and everything else is pretty stellar, pushing exceptional. So I'm not going to do a worst list, because it just wouldn't be worth it. With that said, while this season has its problems, and the overall story is a bit underdeveloped than later seasons, as I said, which does lead to the end of the season feeling a bit rushed and underwhelming for my liking, overall, this season only has tiny little faults here and there, and it's nothing major. And the rest of the season is great, because we get to explore this world, get a good look into our characters, and it sets up much bigger, much more fleshed out things in Season 2. Sure, Season 2 does blow this one out of the water, and we'll get there when we get there, but this season still starts the show out very strong, succeeds at what it tries to do, and has highs. Even though certain things are underdeveloped, its best episodes rival some of the best from other seasons, including Season 2. At least the very top of the list. The best show was in the making from Season 1, even if it's not fully shown off here, and doesn't get that status until later, but these 5 episodes are a prime example of what the show was capable of so early on, and what makes Season 1 just so fantastic. So with all that said, let's get right into the countdown. Here is my list of the top 5 best Avatar: The Last Airbender Season 1 episodes. Now, for a lot of these episodes, I'm gonna go really in depth, explaining why I like them so much, and how they deal with whatever they try to tackle in a really interesting way. There's just so much to unpack in most episodes of Avatar for the reasons I've already stated, because they usually deal with very complex things, and does so much to handle whatever it does well that it deserves the highest analysis and discussion. This is not one of those episodes, though. Unlike the other 4 on this list, The Winter Solstice Part 2 is great and has its complex moments, but it's more here for just how much of a fun ride this episode is. This is, simply put, the most fun episode of the season, where from beginning to end, you're on the edge of your seat because of just how intense it is due to you wanting Aang to achieve his goal of making it to this temple where he can finally communicate with Roku, his past life, to figure out what he needs to do in this time period to fully fulfill his duties as the Avatar. And he has to get in contact with him before the solstice ends, because then he can't talk to him anymore, and throughout this entire episode, everything gets in his way, which leads to so many great scenes and events, which also leads to a complete action-packed experience. From Aang being chased down by Zuko, to him having to maneuver his way through a blockade to get into the Fire Nation, as Zuko does as well, even though he is banished, Zhao letting him go so he can follow him, but Zuko trying to throw him off, to Aang reaching the temple, but realizing the sages aren't loyal to the Avatar anymore, just the Fire Lord, except one who helps him get to where he can communicate with Roku. And through some fun planning, and one last confrontation with the sages plus Zuko, Aang makes it in, with Zhao showing up right behind him with a dozen men waiting for him to come out and capture him. And this is where the episode excels for me. While this episode is a fun ride, I'd be lying if I didn't mention what pushed it over the edge for me was when he talks to Roku and figures out what his goal is. How he needs to learn all 3 elements to stop the Fire Lord before this comet arrives, or else he and his army will gain power to win the war. I had been enjoying the show up until this point, learning more about the characters and the world, and there are some great episodes I'll mention in the honorable mention segment, but this changes the entire direction of the show, and raises the stakes, and also got me hooked. That's why it made the list, because it's such an important episode for that reason, and puts the show on a path towards greatness more than most earlier episodes on top of all of that. Oh yeah, and he has to learn the elements by summer's end. And knowing this is the winter solstice, that's not a lot of time, which adds even more pressure onto him. It raises the tension, gives you more of a reason to watch, and just sets the show in such a good direction, leading to so many great things in the future. But anyways, you have a fun twist of how Aang gets out of this situation, which ends off the episode, and you have a really fun but important episode that does a lot, but succeeds at all of it. Once again, Avatar is a show that deals with many themes and topics relating to its characters and world, so there were some truly outstanding ones that beat this one out, just because they do a lot more and hit me a lot harder emotionally. And also, I definitely think there's one episode before this that I think is even more important and really sets the show on the right path. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But this episode is just so technically impressive and is so much fun, and due to that, I did enjoy watching it more than some of its more ambitious contemporaries, so it just made the list. As I mentioned earlier, this season was more about setting up the world and characters, while telling the story of Aang traveling to the Water Tribe to learn to waterbend, so we can hopefully learn all 4 elements before the comet arrives. And while this episode does that, it actually gives Aang a taste of fire. After getting in a sticky situation during a Fire Nation festival, our heroes are taken to a Fire Nation warrior who deserted due to the evil actions of his nation. Aang, knowing that he may never find another firebender willing to teach him firebending, even if he is going out of order, he decides to persuade Zhang to teach him. Now, this plot on its own is really great, and very different for a Season 1 episode where every firebender who isn't Zuko or Iroh are just kinda the bad guys. And a lot less time and focus is put on the Fire Nation on whole in general, with them just being a big threat, and more of seeing how they influence the rest of the world around them. But what this episode does with its plot turns a lot of that on its head. It breaks down fire as an element to be bended, how it affects the person bending it, the cares and responsibilities that come with that, how letting it consume you can lead to bad things, and its relation with the other elements. The episode just tackles so much through Aang's training with Zhang and the conversations they have. On top of that, it explores the lore of the show in a much more subtle way than you might expect, connecting being a firebender back to the Fire Nation's atrocities. Using Commander Zhao as an example of what the worst being a firebender has to offer, in more ways than one. The episode is just so complex, and I love how they slowly ease you in to all these topics around firebending's role in the world, what it can accomplish, and the lore stuff, through Aang just training and slowly getting more impatient, while the weight of firebending is slowly being revealed to us, the audience. And the main conflict comes from Zhang wanting to teach firebending to Aang slowly, so he can actually learn about all the weight and stuff that comes with it, but Aang wanting to learn it as fast as possible and thinking a lot of what Zhang Zhang does is stupid and a lot of what he's teaching just isn't worth learning. At first, I agreed with Aang. He has so much on his shoulders and a limited time to learn this stuff to fight against villains who bend fire, so he should learn it now and quick. But as we get further into this episode, just from Zhang Zhang talking and seeing how impatient and kinda careless Aang is, you understand why fire is so dangerous and question why he is learning it so quickly and if that's the right thing for him to do. And as I said, they use another example later in the episode to prove what the worst firebending has to offer, while exploring the lore of the Fire Nation in the process. As we get further and further into this training, you really do question if Aang is ready to grasp the complicatedness of bending fire, so you really start struggling with all of that and how much he should learn. But what makes it so complicated is everyone involved realizes, well, Aang should be more patient and careful, and he probably shouldn't be learning all of this right now. They are still on a time crunch, especially when they could be attacked by the Fire Nation at any moment. So the training proceeds, and he moves Aang much quicker than it seems like he would have. And because of that, and because of Aang being careless and stupid, he ends up accidentally burning Katara. In this one scene, which is one of the best of the entire series by the way, it shows the true dangers of bending something like fire. Why bending it is such a serious thing. It takes this fantasy show and puts the bending in a real-world perspective, and it's so heartbreaking to see Aang, who didn't have a care in the world a second ago, and was trying to take this seriously, but was just so happy to be firebending that he wasn't responsible, and when he greatly harms his friend, he doesn't know what to do. Once again, this scene is just so sad, and even though this is a fantasy show, the idea of hurting someone like this by accident from being careless with something you feel so confident about is something I think a lot of people can relate to, even if the context is much smaller, so it makes it even more heartbreaking for that. But this leads into the end of the episode, which shows what our characters take out of all this information and events. Aang decides he never wants to firebend again, which is a decision that lasts until Season 3, because he has the fear of being too careless with such a great power, and a great example of this, which is smartly shown off at the end of the episode, is his confrontation with Zhao. I love how they graciously show how careless he is with his firebending, and how he literally uses brute force with no control, causing all his ships to burn, and Aang doesn't even lift a finger in his fight and just flees. Him being Zhang Zhang's student is another reason of why Zhang Zhang talked about firebending the way he did, and why he thinks it's such a curse, because his student ended up being a huge Fire Nation admiral who's done a ton of horrible things, and you can't really control his powers, which makes this ending all the more clever and satisfying to watch. But in the midst of that, Katara realizes she has healing powers when she heals her burns, and has a very down-to-earth discussion with Zhang Zhang, putting the element's specific roles into place, and this is super cool, especially after all we've learned about firebending in this episode. So yeah, the episode is just so fascinating. It expands the lore a ton, while showing us more about firebending and its connection to everything else, while developing our characters and cleverly using examples, like Zhao, to show the worst aspects of being a firebender off, and what the carelessness and evilness it can lead to, while having super emotional moments to boot, to make you care and understand the dangers of all of this even more. It makes this world feel super fleshed out and more interesting, along with making the balance and power our characters have to deal with even more of a struggle, and makes their journey more complex. And Wow, this episode is just so good, and there's so much stuff to say about it because of just how complex it is, and we're only at number 4 of a best episodes list for season 1. So what were the 3 that topped it? Hopefully, I don't have to spend quite as much time talking about this one, as I think the reasons it's great will take a bit less time to explain. This episode is just great character development early on, for both our hero and villain, while they simultaneously go through different things that have nothing to do with each other. Well, at least not at first. It's so cool how our characters are already being developed in an interesting way this early on, but where they go with it makes it even better. Aang goes back to his home to find out what happened to his people, while Zuko gets his ship repaired at a harbor where the Commander Zhao at this point holds him hostage for information on the Avatar, and even threatens to go after him himself, as we see in the 2 other episodes I talked about. What makes this episode great is that for so early on, we're already dealing with such heavy stuff and making our characters this interesting, including making our villain very sympathetic. The first 2 episodes were good, but nowhere near this level of quality. This one is the first indicator of what the show can be, showing off how fun Aang is and how he wants to figure out what happened to his people and what he needs to do as the Avatar, and not only does he not figure that out, but he figures out his entire population is dead, murdered by the Fire Nation. Yeah, there's some very heavy stuff in this episode, as I said, and when you see Aang react to this, oh, it's just so tragic. The episode does such a good job slowly setting this up, and that Aang probably knew something like this was coming, and that his friends were trying to hide it as long as possible because they didn't want to break Aang's spirits, but you really get to see him hide behind his happiness, so when he reacts like this, when he figures out, it's just so different and in a really sad way. But when Katara brings him back down to Earth, it really builds up his relationship with his friends, especially Katara. This episode just uses exploring this air temple to build up Aang's character and his relationship with the people around him, and the role he's gonna play later on, so Aang can prevent anything like this from happening again. On the Zuko side of things, we get to learn why he is after the Avatar, how much this means to him, even some foreshadowing involving his disagreements with his father. So when he and Zhao get in this conflict, and Zhao even threatens to capture the Avatar first, Zuko challenges him to a duel, and you're actually rooting for him to win, because Zuko doesn't seem like that bad of a guy. And he's been banished, so he wants to get the Avatar back for that reason, which is really cool, and that's why you start to root for him. The episode just builds up our main characters so much, making you care and sympathize with both of them and their struggles. And I love, after learning more about our characters and world, setting them forward on their adventure. Due to Aang's chaos, it leads to the entire world, including the Fire Nation, knowing of his existence, even though Zuko was trying to hide it, and him and Zhao's conflict was all around who knows about the Avatar and who's gonna get it first. Aang's conflict leads to the entire world knowing. It's really cool, and it's a great way to kind of wrap the episode up. It's also a great way to raise the stakes of the show And once again, just a great ending to the episode. So yeah, this episode is just so much fun, and it develops our characters in a great way, and just so early on as well. Along with showing us more of the world, we get to see a bit more into how the Fire Nation operates, and the old Air Temple. Even if it's abandoned, we still get to learn a lot about that. And once again, because it's so early on, all of this really sells the show for you in a way that I don't feel the first 2 episodes do. That's what makes it such an important episode, and that's really the cherry on top of why I love it so much. So because of how important it is so early on, and just how interesting it makes our characters and really fleshes them out, that's why I put it above something like The Deserter, but there are still 2 more episodes to go. Now, even though Avatar's an amazing show, and even Season 1 with its issues, there are many peak episodes for multiple different reasons, as I've proven. And well, you can debate which episode deals with the most interesting topic, or which is the most powerful versus fun, and you can definitely debate which is the most important. Most can agree what the top 2 episodes of the season are. And I hate to admit, but my top 2 are the most predictable choices. But hey, if it's correct, it's correct. Which in this case, it definitely is. Hey, I have a Simpsons list coming up, and maybe my season 2 and 3 lists will surprise you. But yeah, picking out the top 2 spots was very easy, even with competition, and the only real surprise may be how I order them. And with that, I ended up having the Blue Spirit at number 2. But before we talk about the obvious episode that topped it, let me try to put an interesting spin on explaining why one of the most popular and beloved episodes of the show is so good. I think what makes this episode work as well as it does is just how it sets up this story. From Zhao being promoted to Admiral, so he has more power to go after the Avatar than ever before. And with that power, he hires crazy skilled archers and has the power to keep Zuko in one place, basically putting him in checkmate. And you just feel Zuko's hopelessness as he realizes Zhao has the power to capture the Avatar, and he's gonna lose his only chance to return home and restore his place on the throne. Well, on the Aang side of things, he has to go get medicine for his friends who are very sick, and we slowly get to see them deteriorating through the episode, so when Aang gets that medicine, he is captured, adding to the tension of him breaking out of Zhao's grasps. And that's what's so great. Even though the rest of this episode, at this point, is just a prison break, what makes it so fantastic is all these stakes around the importance of Aang and what it would mean if he failed to escape. The Fire Nation would remove their most important threat and be able to take over big cities like Ba Sing Se, as Zhao says, which would easily win them the war, and the other things in this episode give the whole thing even more tension to just round out the second half to absolute perfection. Even stuff that doesn't need to be there, like Katara and Sokka being sick, adds so much. But because of that, when the breakout is happening, that's all you're thinking about. You don't care who this Blue Spirit is, as long as he is Aang's ticket out of here, we're good. Also, did I mention the medicine is frozen frogs? So if he loses these frozen frogs and they unthaw, then he's gonna have to get more from the lady who gave him the medicine. Which once again adds even more tension because he doesn't have that time with Katara and Sokka's deteriorating mental state. And this leads me to the other big point about why this episode is so great, the action. After all this build-up, these action scenes are perfect. Best of the season in my opinion. And the episode allows for all this intensity to just lead into this perfect, non-interrupted breakout scene. With so many cool little moments, it's just so fantastic. But as the fight dies down, in one last-ditch attempt to escape, Aang realizes who the Blue Spirit is as he gets injured, and it's Zuko. Well, this is pretty obvious, all things considered. As I said earlier, you're so focused on the escape that at the very least, I didn't really question who it was, so it did come as kind of a shock first viewing, even if they do a really good job setting up to the fact that it's most likely him. But even though Aang doesn't quite understand why Zuko did this, he helps the two of them escape from their predicament and waits in the forest for him to heal up until he is well enough to attack him again. But in that time, Aang tries to talk with him and brings up some interesting things about both of their destinies, not really caring why Zuko did what he did. But you can definitely tell he wants to reach out to him because there's something different about him compared to the other firebenders. So he brings up some interesting stuff about how in a different time they could have been friends, but it all ends the same. The ending is so powerful and shows such interesting things off about our main characters and leaves such a fun but extremely tense episode on such a depressing note. This episode has it all, really. It's a jailbreak episode that does so much to justify why this jailbreak is so important to everyone involved, and it ends with our main characters questioning things about each other and strengthening the weird parallels between their stories, even if they're so different. Truly remarkable, but it was just beaten out by one other episode that looks at Zuko and Aang's parallels between them even more. But dang, this episode is such a complete package, and truly one of the best I've ever seen from any show, which says wonders about how good my number one had to be to top it. But before we get into what I consider to be the best episode of Avatar Season 1, and one of my favorite episodes from any show because of just how good it is, here are 10 honorable mentions that just missed the list. As I said, even in its first season, there are so many fantastic episodes that used its world and characters in many different ways, which was just more of an example of how great this show was, and we're very close to making the list over some of the very strong contenders that ended up making it. And while they may not have been quite as good as what's on the list, as I said, some of them were very close, and all of them still deserve to be recognized for just being stellar episodes of a great season. I know some people don't love this episode for being the very first one, and a bit rough around the edges in places, and while it definitely is, I personally believe it's still a great one, and better than its follow-up because this episode is a bit more focused than that one is. But yeah, I like how this episode introduces us to our main characters. We get to see an amount of the South Pole while hinting at other locations and what they're like. We get to learn about this war and the revelation of how long Aang's been gone. On top of that, you have some fun moments which show off a lot about our characters and an early introduction of Zuko, getting you interested in him. And while this episode is weirdly paced at points, it doesn't reveal a crazy ton and pales in comparison to later episodes, it's still a fun one that reveals enough to get me hooked, so it succeeds and makes for a great first episode. A fun episode where our main characters explore this weird city, Aang is put through multiple weird tests due to this crazy king, and in the end meets an old friend. It's not an amazing episode or really an important one, but it's the first look we get into the Earth Kingdom, showing off how weird it is and how different it could be, and it's just a lot of fun overall. Another jailbreak sort of episode like the Blue Spirit, but in a very different sense. This episode does such a good job showing off what the Fire Nation has done to this town they travel to and what they have done to the Earthbenders there. And it does a good job showing off why Katara feels obligated to save Haru because she was partially the reason why he got captured due to him helping that old man who sold him out. Well, the rest of this episode is Katara trying to lift these captured Earthbender spirits who are trapped on a metal boat so they can't metal bend, so she has to raise their spirits to get them out of there. It's such a great concept, and they do many fun things with it, which is why it's one of my favorites of the season. a good setup to the next episode, and while I like that more, this episode has a fun plot, we get to see into the spirit world a bit, and this episode develops the lore of the show. It also has a good environmental message, of all things, and here you really get to see how being the Avatar affects Aang. Even if it doesn't have much to do with the rest of the episode, I love Iroh stuff as well. It's fun to learn about his character and his relationship with Zuko. The big reason this episode is great, however, is how it sets up the next one, and this plot about stopping the spirit slowly explores more about what being the Avatar is all about and what his goals could be. But also, the atmosphere is the best of the season, or at least a close second. The colors and environments of this episode are just beautiful. It's still a bit setup-y for my liking, all things considered, and the plot is a bit simple on top of that, but ignoring those very minor problems, which are more personal preference anyways, man, this episode's a trip. This is another one of my favorites, that was close to making the list. I love how they show off how the Fire Nation axe leads to Jet creating this hideout in the trees and getting others to stop the Fire Nation wherever they can. And how Sokka is suspicious, but can't really prove anything because of lack of evidence, and his friends just think he is jealous due to Jet being very cool. And even though Jet is built up to be this really interesting bad boy, but honestly isn't, and is just a jerk who wants to kill anyone fire-related because of traumatic experiences in his past. Now, this could be a problem, but the episode just does such a good job playing around with your expectations about how this story would be told and where it's leading to, with some fun twists and scenes, and a very intense conclusion that leads to a sad ending on top of all of that. The plot of this episode is great, and I like their spin on this Robin Hood-esque story so much, so I had to mention it here. This episode is a good look into Aang's character, how he was trained to be this very respectable, sensitive kid, and was thrown into the role as the Avatar when he didn't want to be, but is still just as scared and lost because of that, proven by him running away from home, and shown again here when he fears his only close friends, who are traveling around the world with him, are going to leave him. So he hides a map that would lead them to their father because he thinks they'd rather see him instead of sticking with Aang. This story fleshes out that side of Aang and how he hides behind his emotions and happiness, and through this story of them meeting Bato of the Water Tribe and Aang stealing this map, we really get to see the relationship of our main characters being developed, along with getting a good look into Water Tribe culture and getting some hints at Katara and Sokka's father, and great action as well when Zuko enters the plot. A great episode showing off how times change, and certain things made for someone who isn't here anymore can be used for other things now, and brings up the debate between preserving and renewing, turning something old into something new. Something as Aang sees as not very good, because one of his old temples, in this case, is being torn down and used to create homes for all these people. It's an interesting topic. I like how they develop this place, and Aang slowly changes his opinion on it from being completely against it to actually supporting these new innovations because of how much they're helping people, and because of that, decides to defend it from the Fire Nation when they try to take it over. It's not the most interesting episode, but it is a cool one and very different from the rest of the season. While I think the actual plot of this episode is kinda generic, I like how they go about it, and we get to see into the culture of the North Pole, along with these weird roles being completely a culture thing, which makes this conflict more interesting. And due to these two things, it's fun watching Katara's conflict with this waterbending master, leading to their final fight, and a fun twist ending, along with a fun Sokka plot, and Aang playing an interesting role in the entire thing. Also, the Zuko stuff is good as well, and the episode on whole does a good job setting up the finale of the season, even if they maybe should have done more here and there throughout the season to set all that up. So yeah, I have my minor issues with the episode, but this one is a pretty solid episode right before the big climax of the season. While this episode is a lot of setup for the next one, it's really good setup. It's fun seeing the beginning of this invasion play out, while seeing these different plots around that slowly come to an end. Sure, Season 1 doesn't do the best at setting up this invasion. It's literally announced a few episodes before. No, scratch that, one episode before. I'm sorry. And they hint at it a little bit throughout the season, but only hint at it. So a lot happens here to try to justify the actions of the next episode, which makes it a bit setup-y for me, and not always in the best way, because there's not always a ton of substance to what's going on, but it still works with what it tries to do, and it's still a really fun, action-packed adventure overall, and you can still feel the stakes raising, so it definitely succeeds at what it tries to accomplish, and, all things considered, does lead into the next episode perfectly. And on top of that, I do just overall enjoy seeing these plots play out, even if not everything's the most interesting. So I had to put it in this video somewhere. As I've stated previously, the season doesn't do a great job building up to this invasion, and all the aspects involved do feel underdeveloped a little bit here as well. I still feel like the episode before it salvages enough of the pieces so that this episode really doesn't suffer at all for it, and it leads to a very satisfying conclusion, and I think it's the best episode it can possibly be under the circumstance. I love how we finally get to see Aang go into the spirit world in full, and love the cool spirits he sees there in the search for the moon and ocean spirits who could help him, but the twist is that they're the ones who need his help, as they're in the real world, and Zhao is after them. It's just so good, and it's really interesting and the best part of the episode. And seeing every aspect of the season wrap up around Zhao's murder of the moon spirit is just fantastic. Even if it's not all built up the best, there's still so many great moments and scenes, which leads to a very satisfying ending of the season, wrapping up all the plots in a very satisfying way. But with all that said, there was still one episode that stands tall above all the rest, and that episode was The Storm. Oh man, here we go. This is easily the best episode of Season 1, and is so close for me to being the best of the series. Like, ridiculously close. But I will talk about that another time. So why is this episode so highly regarded by me and many others? Well, because it perfectly encapsulates this show at its best, and its characters at their most interesting and complex, showing off the parallels between them and making the overall story so much more fascinating. This episode is just about Aang breaking down after a bad confrontation with this fisherman who calls him out for running away and dodging his responsibilities by not being the Avatar these past 100 years due to him being trapped in the ice and throwing the world into chaos. And because of this, Aang reveals his backstory to Katara on how he figured out he was the Avatar and why he ran away, leading to him being trapped in that ice. Well, on the Zuko side of things, after he gets in a heated conflict with one of his crew members over their safety versus capturing the Avatar, Iroh tells them the story of how Zuko was banished and got his scar, while a literal storm is brewing around them. Not only are both these backstories so interesting, and paint such a good picture of why our characters are the way they are, and why their goal or destiny is so important to them, and how they even have to act a certain way around that, but the choice to tell both these stories together is what makes this episode one of a kind. It shows the parallels between them and weird differences so well, better than any other episode of the show. It shows how deeply rooted their journey is tied together, and how when one makes progress, it deeply affects the other. It's so interesting and powerful, and one of the best character studies and deep dives I've ever seen. Because it's not just one, but two character studies, as I've said. I've never quite seen an episode like this that so flawlessly goes through our characters' backstories in such a fast manner while getting all that information out it needs to and not feeling underdeveloped, while at the same time tying our main character's journey even closer together than ever before, making the story and dynamics of this entire series more interesting and some of the most interesting of any show ever, along with having the best atmosphere of season 1, even better than the Winter Solstice Part 1. Like how the day and story starts out so sunny, but it keeps getting darker and more stormy as the episode goes on, and the atmosphere helps you understand what the characters are going through due to a metaphorical and real storm brewing. Also, it makes you really feel the different vibes of both flashbacks. This episode is so beautiful for this, and it makes these powerful scenes even more hard-hitting due to how big and atmospheric they feel and look, and how well-defined these locations are, and how you really get an understanding of how each character feels through the atmosphere of their stories. It really brings out the best in everything and makes this episode downright perfect. But on top of that, I love the ending. How Aang realizes he can't go back and undo the past, but he's here now and can do so much good here and inspires people because of that. He gives them hope. And Iroh tells the others Zuko is a good person, and he strives to be good, but the Avatar means everything to him. It's his only chance to get home and make life have any semblance of what it once was. The Avatar gives him hope. It's just so interesting to see these two struggle with their destinies and choices they've made in the past, which have led them here, and how their past truly affect them. Because even though Zuko isn't part of this story process, we nicely get to see before the final conflict of this episode how this affects him in a really powerful scene. And that's the other thing too, is even removing all of this interesting parallel stuff and how well it ties the characters together and makes their dynamic more interesting and has them reflect on their destinies and their past lives before all of this. The individual stories themselves are just so interesting. It's great we get to see what Aang's home life was like. His relationship with Monk Gyatso and the other kids in the air temples, and how all of that was going to be taken away from him because there were signs of war, and he had to take training more seriously and leave his home to train, which led him to run away, and by an accident while flying, led to all this destruction because he wasn't here the past 100 years due to all of this. Well, Zuko just wanted to be a positive leader and throw his 2 cents into a meeting to protect Fire Nation soldiers that he didn't want to see be used and manipulated by this Fire Nation general, ends up disrespecting his father by doing that to the point where he has to fight his own father in a duel. It shows you how much of a decent guy Zuko was, and that he was just a young kid who had no idea how the Fire Nation really worked and just wanted what was best for his people. And when he doesn't fight his father because he doesn't want to fight his father burns his face and banishes him for his disobedience. You understand why he's so all over the place with his personality and how he wants to act around finding the Avatar versus other things because of just how complicated of a person he is due to his history and all of this. Both these stories are so interesting, and it's great we get to see them back to back because of all these interesting ties around them. And I love, after all of this, how subtly and a bit more bluntly we get to see them come to terms that things will never really be the same, but they're here now, and they can make a difference. In Aang's sense, to stop the Fire Nation, and in Zuko's sense, to capture the Avatar to restore his place within that nation. But after all of this incredibly interesting and really moving stuff, this episode ends with Aang saving the fisherman and Sokka from the storm, while almost freezing himself like he did 100 years ago when he accidentally goes underwater, but using sheer willpower to get out of this. Well, Zuko works to help the people on his ship, seeing the Avatar, but using his common sense to walk away. Their destinies are so interwoven that he will get another chance. And the stare they give each other in this brief moment before they leave each other's sights gives me chills. It's such a good moment. You really get to see throughout this episode why the characters hide behind certain things. Like how Aang hides behind his happiness and cheerfulness and carelessness a lot of the time to mask a lot of the regrets he's covering up from running away from home, while Zuko hides behind sternness and anger and just a lot of hate to mask his regrets of trying to be a good person in front of his father. And I don't think it's put on better display in any other moment than that stare they give each other. It's just so bone-chilling. And when the storm ends and they both move on to continue their journeys, it wraps up the episode perfectly, making it one of the best of all time. So yeah, this is one of the best and most complex episodes of the show, which says so much about our main two characters, the decisions they made in their past, and their journeys moving forward, connecting them so closely together in a way no other show could do, making it one of the best of any show. It really is a special one. Nothing else, even the Blue Spirit, was anywhere close. This episode is just heaven and earth moving levels of good, which is why The Storm easily took the #1 spot on this list. And with that, the list is done. I'm so sorry this list took so long to make. A lot of stuff came up. As I've said in previous videos, my personal life has been rather busy with a lot of things going on. But hey, more stuff's coming soon, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this list as much as I enjoyed making it, because this is one of my favorite shows, and I've wanted to talk about it for a while, and I hope I did the best episodes of Season 1 justice. If you enjoyed this, though, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Also, leave a comment telling me what you thought of my list and what your own would have been. Also, check the description for the links to other videos I've made and a playlist for all the music I used in this video. But if you've been disappointed with me for my lack of videos, my list of the top 5 best Simpsons Season 6 episodes will be coming next and will be coming soon. So until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.